48ers were Europeans that participated in the revolutions of 1848 that had swept across Europe. The German 48ers, many of them came to the United States. Actually, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels
having participated in the lead-up to the revolutions of 1848.
And having published the Communist Manifesto that same year.
In 1845.
They actually considered moving to America for a time, but ended up settling in England. However, many Germans came to the United States to avoid the prosecutions that followed the revolutions of 1848. One of the most famous was Karl Schulz. He was a German revolutionary during the revolutions of 1848. He came to the United States and joined the Republican Party and became a prominent member of the Republican Party. He served as a general in the Union during the American Civil War, and then became one of the founders of the Liberal Republican Party after the war, which we will talk about. But he ended up being appointed Secretary of the Interior under Rutherford B. Hayes, Republican president, who won the 1876 election, which resulted in the Compromise of 1877, which ended up ending Reconstruction. Schurz was a bit more of a well-to-do German, and he had more liberal leanings than a lot of the working-class Germans that came as a result of the revolutions of 1848. So today we'll talk about two in particular, Joseph Wedemeyer and August Willich, who were 48ers that were communists. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of our own local heroes of the Civil War here in Rochester, who are also part of the revolutions of 1848. This is the marching song of the Pennsylvania Dutch Union Regiment during the Civil War. This is a version of John Brown's Body, also known as Battle Hymn of the Republic, but the lyrics of this one focus mainly on food. Size, kraut, coleslaw, potatoes and salad, Bunker Hill. Port, sauerkraut, butter bread and beer, Bunker Hill. Rifle, bayonet, cannon, and pistol, Bunker Hill. So they, in the German language, they apparently took the tune and put their own Deutsch words to it. So, all right, let's start the show. Despite the erasure of American communism from American Civil War history, communists played a major role in what the International Workingmen's Association called the American Anti-Slavery War. Much of the history of the American Civil War ignores the contributions of communists to the Unionist cause. German immigrants, many of whom were communists, were some of the first to join the militant abolitionist movement. Many that had participated in the revolutions against the Prussian Empire in 1848 came to America to escape prosecution by the Prussian authorities. These German revolutionaries led an anti-slavery movement in the United States that helped precipitate the American Civil War. The revolutionary ideas of German philosopher and father of communism Karl Marx inspired some of the German revolutionaries fleeing the trials of 1850, most notably Union Colonel Joseph Wedemeyer. Marx had a profound interest in the United States. He even entertained immigrating to Texas in 1845, but those plans fell through. However, by keeping close contact with his American friends, he ended up becoming one of the most influential contemporary international voices on the American Civil War. Welcome to Pioneers of American Socialism. Historians have often overlooked Marx's influence in America during the Civil War. He had already been encouraging radical German Americans to take up the abolitionist cause and join the Civil War by the time fighting officially broke out in 1861. Some of Marx's friends and acquaintances, including Joseph Wedemeyer and August Willich, became major figures who recruited and led troops in battle against the pro-slavery forces of the South. A discussion of the political forces in the Civil War must include the influence of the communist movement. Marx was optimistic about the American anti-slavery war. He argued the emancipation of black chattel slaves would lead to a new ascendancy of the working class. He even argued a nonviolent proletarian revolution was possible in America after the Civil War. According to Marx, if they were politically enfranchised, freed blacks would join with impoverished farmers to create a strong labor party that could take state power without a violent uprising. Marxist historian Robert Blackburn writes that according to Marx, defeating the slave power and freeing the slaves would not destroy capitalism, but it would create conditions far more favorable to organizing and elevating labor, whether white or black. Although Marx's dream of a nonviolent proletarian revolution did not come to fruition, the Civil War did lead to new opportunities for the American working class. His predictions came partially true in 1866, a year after the official end of the fighting, when American workers formed the National Labor Union, the first national federation in America, National Labor Federation in America. The NLU opened new avenues of collective power for workers. However, the emergence of labor organizations was not the only sign of hope for a positive outcome for black and white workers after the American Civil War. Since the Southern bourgeoisie considered chattel slaves property, not humans, emancipation of blacks from Southern slavery would mean one of the greatest expropriations of private property from the bourgeoisie in human history. The Southern slave owners would have their wealth, slaves, seized and redistributed to the working class, emancipated blacks. Mainstream Republicans like Abraham Lincoln, who the people elected to the presidency of the United States in 1860, did not initially endorse such a dramatic project of wealth redistribution. Lincoln argued for various half measures, including gradual emancipation that would monetarily compensate slave owners. Northern states like Pennsylvania enacted gradual emancipation laws as early as 1780. As late as December 1, 1862, Lincoln addressed Congress calling for a program of gradual emancipation that would compensate slave owners for their loss of human property. However, through the work of radicals like Karl Marx abroad and immigrants like Joseph Wedemeyer in the United States, Lincoln eventually came to favor full immediate emancipation of black slaves. Lincoln's change of heart came at the urging of those Germans who had immigrated to America to avoid prosecution for their revolutionary activities against the Prussian authorities. German revolutionaries began to come to the United States after a series of rebellions against the Prussian Empire in Germany in 1848. In 1850, the Prussian authorities put many German communists on trial for their roles in the uprisings. Marx, along with his comrade and writing partner Friedrich Engels, were already living in England at the time. However, many other German radicals chose America as the location for their self-exile. Radical German immigrants immediately flocked to the Republican Party, who opposed the anti-immigrant positions of the Know Nothing Party, a nativist party popular in the 1850s. Eventually, Republican sympathies led 200,000 German immigrants to fight for the Union in the American Civil War. 36,000 fought in German-speaking units throughout the course of the war. German-American radicals corresponded with Europeans like Karl Marx, imploring them to agitate for the British abolitionists to support the Union cause. In an article published by the German newspaper Die Presse on October 25, 1861, Marx polemicized against British arguments that the American Civil War was a tariff war, not a war over slavery. Marx concluded the whole movement rested and rests, as one sees, on the slavery question. Not in the sense of whether the slaves within the existing slave states should be directly emancipated or not, but whether the 20 million free men of the North should subordinate themselves any longer to an oligarchy of 300,000 slaveholders. Marx made a clear connection between the abolitionist cause and the unionist cause. The Republican Party would soon exploit the connection to drum up support for the war effort. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, solidifying the Northern Unionist cause as explicitly anti-slavery. European radicals and abolitionists applauded Lincoln's proclamation. Marx chided the British abolitionists that claimed the American Civil War was not about slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation silenced the British abolitionists' objections. So confident was Marx that the proclamation signified the progressive character of the Unionist cause that he felt compelled to communicate with Lincoln and wish him success. In January of 1865, under the auspices of the First International Workingmen's Association, Marx and Engels addressed a letter to the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. They expressed their hope for a progressive result from the American anti-slavery war, writing,
While the working men, the true political powers of the North, allowed slavery to defile their own republic, while before the Negro mastered and sold without his concurrence, they boasted it the highest prerogative of the white-skinned laborer to sell himself and choose his own master. They were unable to attain the true freedom of labor or support their European brethren in their struggle for emancipation. But this barrier to progress has been swept off by the Red Sea of Civil War. The U.S. government opened unofficial diplomatic ties with the International Workingmen's Association, also known as the First International, which had its headquarters in London at the time. The International was able to bypass the British government, who was still somewhat hostile to the North, to drum up foreign support for Northern Republicans. Most European radicals cared little for Lincoln's argument that the Civil War was to keep the Union together. It was not until Marx connected the war with slavery that European radicals began to support the North. In 1865, Marx wrote to Engels, "Apropos, the fact that Lincoln has replied to us so courteously and to the Bourgeois Emancipation Society so rudely and purely formally has so angered the Daily News that it did not print the reply to us. When, however, it saw to its sorry that the Times did so, it had to do the same belatedly in the Stop the Press section. Levy, too, has had to bite the sour apple. The difference between Lincoln's answer to us and the bourgeois has made such a stir here that the clubs in the West End are shaking their heads over it. You can understand how much good this does our people." Marx took much pleasure in the fact that Lincoln's representative sent a reply to the Workingmen's Association, but snubbed the upper-class British abolitionists. Clearly, Marx and the other European radicals had Lincoln's ear. Thanks to pressure from ultraists, as American radicals were called at the time, abolitionists, including German immigrants and European radicals, Lincoln put slavery at the center of his platform by the second inaugural address in 1865. In the last year of his life, Abraham Lincoln sought out Frederick Douglass. Douglass and other black leaders persuaded Lincoln to abandon his colonizationist position on the question of emancipation. Colonizationists wanted to send free blacks to the American colony of Liberia in Africa. Blacks argued they had a stake in America because of all the labor they put into building the nation. Lincoln seemed profoundly affected by his increased contact with blacks and abolitionists. Although Marx favored socialism as the vehicle for emancipation of the workers, Lincoln was a proponent of free labor, market competition as a path to emancipation. However, Marx and Lincoln's positions aligned on the issue of immediate emancipation of black chattel slaves. Marx had been deeply concerned with the problem of slavery in America for some time. He followed closely the slave revolts in America. On January 11, 1860, he wrote to Engels, "In my opinion, the biggest things now happening in the world are, on the one hand, the American slave movement started by the death of John Brown, and the slave movement in Russia on the other. I have just seen in the Tribune that there has been a new slave uprising in Missouri, naturally suppressed, but the signal has now been given. If things gradually get serious, what will become of Manchester?" Marx believed the Russian and American slave revolts represented a movement that would bring the emancipation of the whole working class. Marx hoped these two revolts would inspire an international proletariat revolution. He started publicizing his anti-racist beliefs as early as 1849, when he explained the position of the black slave in an article for the German leftist newspaper Neue Reiche Zeitung. What is a Negro slave? A man of the black race. The one explanation is good another. A Negro is a Negro. He becomes a slave only in certain relationships. A cotton spinning machine is a machine for spinning cotton. Only in certain relationships does it become capital. Torn from these relationships, it is no more capital than gold in and by itself is money or sugar, the price of sugar. Marx argued there was nothing essential to the character of black people that made them pro to slavery. Slavery was an economic relationship, a relationship of exploitation. Marx's advocacy of emancipation and his socialist theories ingratiated him to American ultraists.
All right, now I'm going to play a clip from a song. This is a satirical song that was originally written by John F. Poole about the 48ers in the Civil War. It's called I Goes to Fight mit Siegel. Siegel was Franz Siegel, who was a military officer during the American Civil War. He was also a 48er. He was a leader of the Baden Revolutionary Forces in the 1848 rebellion. And, like many of the 48ers came here to the United States. And it's significant to mention that the 48ers joined the Civil War not because they cared whether or not the United States stayed together, but they fought in the Civil War against slavery, which, many unionists were not necessarily against slavery. So they really turned the tide of the unionist struggle.
Then I run for fierce one, then I try to make it, but now I march with musket out. Save that Yankee eagle, they dress me up in soldiers' clothes to go and fight McSeagle. God, das is true, I speaks Mitch, he goes to fight McSeagle. I get sein big Tom rifle gun and puts him to my shoulder. Then I march around like a big jack horse or maybe something more. I goes off with the volunteers to save their Yankee eagle and to give them rebel fellers fits. I goes to fight with Seagull. Now das is true, I speak with you.
I like that version though because it has a little bit of an Irish sound, and there were indeed many Irish immigrants that fought in the Civil War on both sides, unfortunately. But the Fourierist Edward A. Theller, who was a founder of the Clarkson Phalanx, was an Irish Republican. He was an Irish American Catholic, and he had also fought in the Nationalist Rebellion against the British Empire in Canada in the failed Canadian Revolution of 1837. Marx's link to the United States was also his link to Fourierism, as we mentioned in the Fourierist, the episode about Fourierism, Honest Hands Toil for Daily Bread. Marx started working at the New York Tribune, which was owned by Horace Greeley, who was a Fourierist. Greeley will come up a little bit later when we talk about the election of 1872, and then follow up with the election of 1876. But for now, we know Greeley as a socialist. And the Fourierist Charles A. Dana, who was a member of Brook Farm, was the person that recruited Marx to work for Greeley's Tribune. Marx's career at the Tribune got off to a rocky start. At first, Marx was not confident writing in English. He asked Engels to write the first articles Marx sold to the Tribune on conditions in England and Germany. Engels, a skilled linguist and fluent English speaker, was happy to oblige his impoverished friend. Publishers later collected the articles Engels supplied into a single volume entitled Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Germany in 1848. The public did not know that Engels was the author until 1913. Marx's first original contributions to the Tribune came in 1852. Still, Marx wrote the articles in German and passed them along to Engels to translate into English. Finally, in 1853, Marx was confident enough to write in English. Engels encouraged Marx, writing him, "Your English is not only good, it is brilliant." When the Civil War broke out, Marx found it difficult to pay his bills as a foreign correspondent for the Tribune. Americans' interest in the revolutions of Europe waned in favor of the tumultuous happenings in their own country. Marx wrote in a letter dated May 6, 1861, "American conditions are rather harmful for me personally, as for the time being, transatlantic newspaper readers have eyes and ears only for their own affairs." In February, the Tribune suspended all foreign correspondents except Marx, who was their highest paid. Between October 1861 and March 1862, Marx wrote his last 9 pieces for the Tribune. All 9 dealt with the American Civil War. On October 11, 1861, the Tribune published Marx's article on the American question in England. Marx chided the British abolitionists for not supporting the Union cause of the North. The British abolitionists argued the North merely wanted to save the Union, not necessarily end slavery. Marx countered by saying the South seceded because of slavery. Marx wrote, "The progressive abuse of the Union by the slave power, working through its alliance with the Northern Democratic Party, is, so to say, the general formula of the United States history since the beginning of this century. The Kansas War, the formation of the Republican Party, and the large vote cast for Mr. John C. Fremont, the first Republican presidential candidate, during the election of 1856, were so many palpable proofs that the North had accumulated sufficient energies to rectify the aberrations which United States history, under the slave owners' pressure, had undergone for a half-century, and to make it return to the true principles of its development." Marx saw the Civil War as the first step in correcting the essential flaw in American history, America's capitulation to the Southern slave-owning elites. On October 14, 1861, the Tribune published an article by Marx on the effects of the war on British cotton prices. He concluded, "As long as the English cotton manufacturers depend on slave-grown cotton, it would be truthfully asserted that they rested on a twofold slavery, the indirect slavery of the white man in England and the direct slavery of the black man on the other side of the Atlantic. Marx anticipated the argument Trinidadian politician and scholar Eric Williams would make in Capitalism and Slavery, published in 1944. Williams wrote on the origins of slavery in the New World. Negro slavery, therefore, was only a solution in certain historical circumstances of the Caribbean labor problem. Sugar meant labor at times that labor had been slave, and at other times nominally free, at times black, at other times white or brown or yellow. Slavery in no way implied, in any scientific sense, the inferiority of the Negro. Without it, the great development of the Caribbean sugar plantations between 1650 and 1850 would have been impossible. Williams and Marx both argued that slavery was a particular economic relationship that became responsible for the growth of capitalism from the 15th to 19th centuries. Marx's October 5, 1861 article for the Tribune explored shifting attitudes in the British House of Lords towards the Northern Unionist cause in the United States. He argued there was a sudden change in the British elite's position towards the American North. The London elites no longer benefited from their business arrangements with Southern American slave owners. Marx cited a press release from the office of Henry John Temple and Viscount Palmerston, and then the Prime Minister of England, as evidence of such a shift. Palmerston's office wrote, "We are less dependent on the South than the South is upon us, as they will ere long begin to discover. We therefore pray them to believe that slavery, so long as it exists, must create more or less of a moral barrier between us, and that even tacit approval is as far from our thoughts as the impertinence of an open interference. And for the honor and spirit of our manufacturing population, be it said also that even if it were, cotton would not be king." American Unionist, Republican, and abolitionist readers of the Tribune were likely heartened by the change of tone from the elites abroad. The cotton trade was an essential source of income for the South. Without England as a most important trading partner, the South was economically crippled. On November 7, 1861, the Tribune published the London Times on the Orleans Princes in America, an article Marx wrote on October 12th. He chided the London Times for their negative coverage of the French elite's involvement in the American Civil War. Prince Joinville, the Duke of Penthièvre, the Count of Paris, and the Duke of Chartres, all of them princes of the House of Orleans, descendants of a 17th century monarch, Louis XIII, traveled to America and joined the Northern Army. The conservative London Times published a hit piece on the Princes of Orleans, ridiculing their involvement in foreign affairs. Marx responded, "French Emperor Louis Bonaparte, Napoleon III, is of course too much of a businessman to share the judicial blindness in regard to the American war of the official public opinion monger. He knows that the true people of England, France, and Germany, of Europe, consider the cause of the United States as the free soil of the landless millions of Europe, as their land of promise, now to be defended sword in hand from the sordid grasp of the slaveholder." Marx argued Napoleon III understood that the French people, still full of revolutionary fervor from their own revolutions of 1848, had sympathy for the slaves and the anti-slavery forces of the North. England would do well to take heed and pay attention to the attitudes of their own working classes towards the cause of the American Unionists. Marx offered a radical internationalist perspective on the American Civil War that American readers voraciously consumed. While the Tribune mainly published Marx's correspondence on attitudes towards the Civil War abroad, Marx's articles in the German newspaper Die Presse during the same time period show how closely Marx paid attention to the events of the United States and agitated for British support of the American North. For example, Marx wrote an article published by Die Presse in November 1861 that encapsulated the zeitgeist of the Republican-aligned masses of the North. Marx decried the expulsion of John C. Fremont, the first Republican candidate from the Office of General Command of the United States Army in Missouri, for his hardline stance against Confederate sympathizers. Fremont, without approval from President Lincoln, had put Missouri under martial law and called for the immediate emancipation of slaves belonging to Confederate sympathizers. Lincoln responded by relieving Fremont from his charge. This action made working-class Republicans suspicious of Lincoln. Marx explained, "Fremont is the idol of the Northwestern states, which celebrate him as the pathfinder. They regard his dismissal as a personal insult." He then prophesied, if the Union government should meet with a few more misfortunes like Bull Run and Ball's Bluff, it has itself given the opposition, which will then rise up against it and smash the hitherto prevailing diplomatic system of waging war, its leader in John Fremont. Lincoln's reversal of position and issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation in early 1863 is proof that Marx's prediction was correct. The Union could not afford to alienate the ultraist abolitionists if they hoped to win the war. The North should not have offered Fremont to the South as a sacrificial lamb. Clearly, Marx had a profound understanding of both the objective and material realities and the subjective public opinion of the masses in America.
My name is Fountain Hughes. I was born in Charlottesville, Virginia. My grandfather belonged to Thomas Jefferson. My grandfather was 115 years old when he died. And now I am 101 years old. It's what they call, we were slaves. We belonged to people. They sell us like they sell horses and cows and hogs and all like that. Have an auction bench and they put you up on the bench and bid on you, the same as you're bidding on cattle, you know. Sell the women, sell the men. Oh, that colored people didn't have no beds when they were slaves. They all slept on the floor. Pallet here, pallet there. Just like a lot of wild people. We didn't know nothing. Didn't like to look at no book. So I never wore no shoes until I was 12 or 13 years old. Now people put on shoes on babies, you know, when they're month old, I'd be out an hour. Put shoes on babies, just as soon as you see them out in the street, they got shoes on.
Wooden tray, dug out, you know, all about that long. And all of them, you know, would get around that tray with spoons and just eat, something like mush or soup or something like that. And all them children get around there and just eat.
Night never comes out. You have nothing to do. Time to cut tobacco. If they want you to cut all night long out in the field, you cut. And if they want you to hang all night long, you hang tobacco. It didn't matter about your tired, being tired, you're afraid to say you're tired.
But the thing that poor old woman carried in the peach orchard and whipped her. And, you know, just tied her hands this way, you know, around the peach orchard tree. I remember that just as well, looked like to me, I can't. And round the tree and whipped her. And well, she couldn't do nothing but just kick her feet, you know, just kick her feet. But it just had her clothes all down to her waist, you know. Just didn't have her plumb naked, but they had her clothes down to her waist. And every now and then they'd whip her, you know, and then snuff the pipe out on her, you know. She snuffed the pipe out on her. You know, the embers in the pipe. Don't you ever see the pipe smoking?
Blow them out on her?
Mm-hmm.
Good Lord.
So there you heard a testimony collected by John Henry Falk, who was a radio host in the 1940s, storyteller, and these were interviews that he collected with people living at the time that had been slaves. So four of the people that he interviewed were Fountain Hughes, Aunt Harriet Smith, Alice Gaston, and Laura Smalley. So it's important to get that perspective, you know, an eyewitness to the atrocities that led up to the Civil War, and that really was very necessary to fight to end that atrocious system of human rights abuses.
Flower pots and a light 500 suns. I've already abolished the whorehouses of France. Tangiers are the next to go. My ambition is to be president, despite the fact that I'm a Catholic. America, how can I write a holy litany in your silly mood? I will continue, like Henry Ford. My strokes are as individual as his automobile, more so they're all different sexes. America, I will sell you strokes 2,500 apiece, 500 down on your old stroke. America free Tom Mooney. America save the Spanish loyalists. America Sacco and Vanzetti must not die. I am the Scottsboro boys. America, when I was 7, Mama took me to communist cell meetings. They sold us garbanzos a handful per ticket. A ticket cost a nickel and the speeches were free. Everybody was angelic and sentimental about the workers. It was also sincere. You have no idea what a good thing the party was in 1835. Scott Neary was a grand old man of your Mitch. What made me cry was...
One of the ways Marx was able to so astutely analyze the situation in America was by keeping in touch with his comrades who had emigrated there. His friend and comrade Joseph Wedemeyer was instrumental in these endeavors. Wedemeyer is widely considered the first American Marxist. He was born in 1818, the son of a Prussian government official. He went to the military academy in Berlin, where he acquainted himself with the young Hegelian philosophy students, of which Marx and Engels were members. Wedemeyer became a relatively well-known journalist in the late 1840s. The bourgeois papers decried his methods of exposing existing social ills and deficiencies down to the last detail. Wedemeyer soon began distributing and publishing Marx's works. After several groups, including the Communist League, with which Marx and Engels had aligned, rebelled against the Prussian authorities in the German revolutions of 1848, Wedemeyer became increasingly fearful of being arrested for his activities with the League. By 1851, Wedemeyer was seriously considering going into exile in America. Marx wrote a letter to him in August of 1851. I should have liked, even though it is impossible to hold you here, at least to have seen you and spoken with you before your departure. And if you're going to America, you could not find a more propitious moment for doing so, both for finding a way to make your living as well for doing useful work for our party. When you are in New York, go see Charles A. Dana of the New York Tribune and give him regards from Philegraph and myself. He may be of use to you. As soon as you arrive, write me at once, but still at Engel's address, since he is in the best position to forward our mail. If you can remain in New York, you will not be far removed from Europe, and with the complete suppression of the press in Germany, a press campaign can only be waged from New York. Marx and Engels both expressed sorrow over Weidemeyer's plan to depart to America, but they also saw that he could be useful to the movement there. Engels wrote in a letter to Marx, "We need a reliable person like Weidemeier in New York. After all, New York is not out of our world, and we know that when we need him, Weidemeier can be relied on." Marx immediately called upon Charles A. Dana, editor at the New York Tribune, for whom, as mentioned above, Marx had written articles to see if he could get Weidemeier a job. When Weidemeier first arrived in New York in 1851, he was not impressed. He told Marx and Engels, "I did not go to America of my own volition, but I must confess that so far I have seen nothing which can awaken within me the slightest affection for America. I don't think there is another place where one encounters the shopkeeper's mentality and more revolting nakedness. Any other aim in life besides making money is considered an absurdity here, and you can see it on every face, on every brick. Among the great mass of Germans living here, one finds the most wretched specimens imaginable." However, Weidemeier made his way into the German immigrant community in New York. In January 1852, he began publishing his own German-language communist newspaper entitled Die Revolution. Weidemeier meant for the paper to make German immigrants literate about the news of the world and to offer communist analysis of the world's big events. Unfortunately, financial concerns caused the paper to dissolve after only 2 issues. Marx and Engels then enlisted Weidemeier as their literary agent in America. Weidemeier published many of Marx's most important works for Americans to read in English for the first time. In 1853, Weidemeier helped join mostly immigrant trade unions from various fields together into the American Workers' League, AWL. They had some success in a handful of collective bargaining campaigns. Weidemeier put a lot of effort into building solidarity between the English and German-speaking workers. He was able to persuade some members of the AWL to join the Marxist Working Men's National Association, WNA, who called for all laws affecting the workers to be enacted by the federal Congress rather than by the individual state legislatures. In this sense, the WNA were unionists, believing a strong federal government was necessary to protect workers. Weidemeier believed, like Marx, that slavery was bad for all workers because it drove labor costs down. In 1854, Weidemeier and other German Americans, some involved in the revolutions of 1848, organized nationwide demonstrations against the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Kansas-Nebraska Act made it legal for slave owners to enter the new territories of Kansas and Nebraska. Weidemeier and other labor activists argued the bill prevented the influx of free labor immigrants to the Western territories. That same year, Weidemeier began to agitate for the Free Soil or Homestead movement. Homesteaders, who later formed the Free Soil Party, believed that the government should parcel out free land in the West to small farmers. Initially, many Marxists who opposed private ownership of land, especially land to which indigenous peoples, who Marx and Engels considered primitive communists, claimed usufruct rights, were skeptical of the Homestead movement. However, eventually communists in America came to a consensus on land reform. A passage of the Homestead Act would further the growth of industrial capitalism, but would ultimately benefit the proletariat as it would reduce unemployment. Marx wrote in 1846, "We fully recognize the movement of American national reformers, free soilers, in its historical justification. We know that this movement strives for a result that, to be sure, for the time being, would further the industrialism of the modern bourgeois society, but that as a result of the proletarian movement, as an attack on land ownership altogether, and especially under the existing conditions in America, its own consequences must drive it towards communism. Thus, the soil is to remain inalienable common property, and for all humanity at that, by dividing it up without delay." Marx argued the free soil movement was a proletarian revolution that had revolutionary potential. Referring to utopian socialists like Charles A. Dana and Horace Greeley, Marx said, "The communist tendencies in America had to appear originally in this agrarian form that seemingly contradicts all communism. The Fourierist socialists based their communist experiments on an agrarian economic model. The free soil movement was a logical next step for socialists like Dana and Greeley. The free soil movement took on even more importance for American workers when the slavery question was introduced by the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Former Fourierists like Dana and Greeley wholeheartedly put their efforts into agitating for an influx of free labor rather than slave labor into the new territories. The struggle between the slave-owning oligarchs of the South and the working people of America became increasingly heated into the 1850s over the fate of the frontier West. Joseph Wedemeyer and other radical immigrants were also deeply concerned about the issue of slavery and the developments in the American West. In 1856, they formed the Communist Club in New York City. Members of the Communist Club campaigned for Abraham Lincoln's presidency in 1860. Wedemeyer was key to rallying the American labor movement to the Republican cause. A few months after the official outbreak of the Civil War, Wedemeyer went to Missouri to fight slave owners and to make sure the Union admitted Missouri, until recently a contested territory, as a free state. Wedemeyer felt his military experience would be useful. He believed that the abolitionists should establish St. Louis as a base for Union operations in the Western Territory. In 1862, Wedemeyer took command of a regiment that successfully crushed Confederate guerrilla forces in Missouri. In 1864, Wedemeyer became colonel of the 41st Infantry Missouri Volunteers Regiment. By the time fighting was beginning to wind down in 1864, Wedemeyer was rallying German Americans to support radical Republican Clement Thomas Fletcher for Missouri governor. Fletcher won the 1864 gubernatorial election thanks to the help of Wedemeyer and other German immigrants in Missouri. He served as Missouri governor from 1865 to 1869. In 1866, Wedemeyer helped form the National Labor Council that agitated for an 8-hour workday. He died in August of that same year. His obituary in the German-language newspaper Illinois Slazeitung read, Wedemeyer's deeds, assure him for all time an honorable place among the champions of freedom for all peoples.
Is raging, Johnny has to fight. I want to be with him from morning till night. I want to be with him, it grieves my heart so. Won't you let me go with you? Tomorrow is Sunday, Monday is the day that your captain call you, and you must obey. Your captain will call you, it grieves my heart so. Won't you let me go with you? No, my love, no. I'll tie back my hair, man's clothing I'll put on. I'll pass as your comrade as we march along. I'll pass as your comrade, no one will ever know. Won't you let me go with you? No, my love, no. Oh Johnny, I fear you are unkind. I love you far better than all of mankind. I love you far better than words can e'er express. Won't you let me go with you? Yes, my love, yes. Oh 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 yes, my love, yes.
Joseph Wedemeyer was not the only former member of the German Communist League forced into exile because of the revolutions of 1848, nor was he the only communist to fight in the American Civil War. August Willich was another German-American communist who fought in the Civil War. Willich, like Wedemeyer, started his military career in the Prussian army, becoming a captain in 1841. In 1846, Willich resigned from the Prussian army in a letter so inflammatory that the Prussian authorities deemed him worthy of a court-martial. However, the Prussians acquitted him and allowed him to resign. Willich was exiled to Switzerland for his participation in the German revolutions of 1848. Engels had traveled with Willich as his aide-de-camp during the Baden-Palatine uprising. Willich then led a left-wing faction of true socialists in 1850 that split from the Communist League. Their gripe was with Karl Marx, who they determined was too right-wing and had to be stopped. A young French follower of Willich, Emmanuel Barthélemy, conceived of an outlandish plan to kill Marx. The schism led Konrad Schramm, a young devotee of Marx, to insult Willich on Marx's behalf. Willich challenged Marx to a duel. Rather than fight face-to-face and risk either leader actually dying, Schramm stood in for Marx, while Barthélemy stood in for Willich. Wilhelm Liebknecht, friend and admirer of Karl Marx, described the event in 1896. The differences with the Willich sect grew bitter, and one evening Marx was challenged by Willich. Marx had the proper contempt for these Prussian officers' frolics, but the young comrade, Konrad Schramm, a Hotspur, now insulted Willich on his part, thus forcing the latter to challenge him according to his own code of honor. It was agreed to fight the duel in Belgium on the seacoast with pistols. Schramm had never had a pistol in his hand previous to the challenge, while Willich never missed the ace of hearts at 20 paces. He took Barthélemy as a second. We were alarmed for the life of our fresh, chivalrous Schramm. The day fixed for the duel passed on, we counted the minutes. In the evening of the following day, the door of Marx's house is opened. He was not home, only Mrs. Marx and Lenchen, and enter Barthélemy bowing stiffly and replying sepulchral tone to the anxious question, "What news?" Schramm has a bullet in his head, whereupon bowing stiffly once more, he turned and withdrew. You may imagine the fright of the half-insensible lady. She knew now that her instinctive dislike had not deceived her. 1 hour later, she related the sad news to us. Of course, we gave up Schramm for lost. The next day, while we were just talking about him sadly, the door is open and in comes a bandaged head, but gaily laughing, the sadly mourned one, and relates that he had received a glancing shot which had stunned him. When he recovered consciousness, he was alone on the seacoast with his second and his physician. Willich and Barthélemy had returned from Ostend on the steamer, which they had been able to reach. With the next boat, Schramm followed. Schramm's comrades were relieved he survived with a bullet in his head. Barthélemy, however, met an unfortunate end. On his way to assassinate Napoleon III, he decided to collect a debt someone owed him from some work he did as a mechanic. The debtor somehow angered Barthélemy. He fired the weapon meant for Napoleon at the debtor, killing him. He also shot 2 police officers that had arrived to investigate the commotion. One of the police officers died. Barthélemy wounded the other. The French authorities sentenced Barthélemy to death by hanging. Willich did not seem disheartened by the result of the duel or the death of his comrade. He continued his anti-Marxist agitation well into 1850. In 1853, Willich immigrated to the United States. He worked in the Navy Yard in Brooklyn as a carpenter. Willich apparently brought his sectarian tomfoolery with him to America. Wedemeyer felt compelled to write an article with another emigre forced into exile because of the revolutions of 1848, exposing the libelous, insulting, sometimes violent methods of Willich and his group. Wedemeyer called them agents. The article states, "The agents know that the unity of action, the sureness and agreement in thought, which have always characterized them and kept them together through thick and thin, will not be understood by their opponents, because the latter have themselves never had firmly grounded principles." The Marxist group, led by Wedemeyer, remained the dominant force in the German immigrant labor movement in America. American communists did not tolerate Willich's sectarian tactic. In 1858, Willich moved to Cincinnati and became editor of the German Republican, a German-language anti-slavery newspaper. Willich enlisted in the first call to arms of the American Civil War in 1861 with the 1st German Regiment, which later became the 9th Ohio Regiment. Indiana Governor Oliver P. Morton, so impressed with Willich's service, requested he take command as colonel of the 32nd Indiana Infantry Regiment. The 32nd saw action at Shiloh and repelled an attack by Texas Rangers on November 26, 1861. Confederates captured Willich at the Battle of Stone River, December 31, 1862, but they paroled him in exchange for a Confederate prisoner of war in 1863. He remained active in many Civil War battles, and he rose quickly through the Union Army ranks. The Army gave him the rank of Major General on October 21st, 1865. After the war, he became the auditor for Hamilton County, Ohio. Willich and his true socialists never became as influential as Karl Marx and his group, either in Europe or America. However, despite their disagreements and sordid past, Marx felt moved to write about him. In the Civil War in North America, Willich showed that he is more than visionary. As Civil War fighting drew to a close in 1865, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels predicted the South would be the ultimate victors of the American Civil War. In July of 1865, Engels wrote Marx, "I like Mr. President of the United States Andrew Johnson's policy less and less. Hatred of Negroes comes out more and more violently, while as against the old lords of the South, he lets all power go out of his hands. If things go on like this, in 6 months, all of the old villains of secession will be sitting in Congress at Washington. Without colored suffrage, nothing whatever can be done there, and Johnson leaves it to be vanquished, the ex-slaveholders, to decide upon this matter. It is too absurd." The dream of emancipation died with the assassination of Republican President Abraham Lincoln, who Marx and Engels lauded as the single-minded son of the working class. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 had excited Marx, but Lincoln's successor, Democrat Andrew Johnson, did not impress Marx and Engels. Ultimately, the interests of the Republican bourgeoisie of the North and the Democratic bourgeoisie of the South were too similar. Real emancipation and political enfranchisement of the black voters was not a reality. The biracial Labor Party Marx envisioned never materialized. The bloodless workers' revolution did not take place in America. Marx still clung to hope when, in the 1867 preface to his formative book Capital, he endorsed the radical Republican plan to give each freed slave 40 acres and a mule. Andrew Johnson's vice president, Benjamin Wade, Marx wrote, had declared in public meetings that after the abolition of slavery, a radical transformation in the existing relations of capital and landed property is on the agenda. Unfortunately, this plan never came to fruition. The radical Republican-dominated Senate failed to impeach Andrew Johnson, who openly sided with white supremacists. Marx wrote to Engels in 1866, "After the Civil War phase, the United States really is only now entering the revolutionary phase, and the European wiseacres who believe in the omnipotence of Mr. Johnson will soon be disillusioned." In an 1867 letter, Marx called Johnson a dirty tool in the hands of the former slaveholders. Although Marx's dream of full emancipation for the working class, regardless of race, was not achieved, the Civil War nonetheless was a source of hope for Marxists and socialists the world over. The communists from Germany felt it was the utmost important to be involved in the Civil War struggle against slavery. Communists like Weidemeyer and Willich were instrumental in using their Prussian military experience to secure victory for the Union. In 1848, the 1848 revolutions in Germany were a precipitating factor in the outbreak of the American Civil War. Had the Prussian Empire not forced German radicals like Weidemeyer and Willich into exile in America, they would not have been able to agitate so successfully for the Republican anti-slavery cause. Abolitionist John Brown was right when, as he was being taken to the gallows for leading an army of escaped slaves to raid the armory in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, he wrote in a note, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land can never be purged away but with blood. I had, as I now think, vainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done." Communists were very much willing to use their military experience to purge away the great sin of slavery with blood. Although Marx's dream of a nonviolent workers' revolution did not take place after the Civil War, the slave system of the American South was defeated. It would not be until the Civil Rights Act of 1864 that the government granted blacks the full legal rights promised them almost a century before by the 14th Amendment in 1868. However, the Civil War, or what Marx and his comrades called the American Anti-Slavery War, was worth fighting in the eyes of Karl Marx and the communists who fought.
But without our friends, not a single day. We can break their hearts. Gain our freedom when we left at the Union. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever.
And you're listening to Joe Glazer with Charlie Bird on guitar. There with some selections from the album Songs of Work and Freedom. It was an album put out actually by the AFL-CIO in the United States and Canada, a bunch of labor songs. And now we'll have a little bit of Rochester history, since I am from Rochester. A lot of my work and a lot of what we've talked about has sort of had Rochester as an epicenter. I'm going to read from an article entitled "The Germans of Rochester, Their Traditions and Contributions" by Blake McKelvey, published in the Rochester History Journal, January 1958. Most of the early German settlers at Rochester were young adults, but many soon produced children whose schooling became an active concern. For a decade or more, those born in America quickly picked up English and merged easily into the public school. But as the flood of new immigrants mounted, especially after the 1848 revolution in their homeland, the number speaking German often exceeded those using English in certain neighborhoods, and the need for schools to teach the youth became so urgent. St. Joseph's Church had taken the initiative in organizing a parish school in 1836, the first in the city. When its pupils reached 200 and overflowed the basement rooms in the new edifice, the congregation determined to erect a school building on an adjoining lot and dedicated it in 1851. Two other parochial schools offering some instruction in German as well as in English appeared during that decade, and the opening of a Hebrew, German, and English institute in 1856 provided opportunities for adults. The influence of these newcomers increased rather dramatically during the 50s. A political group known as the German Democratic Association had attracted occasional press notice since 1840. It developed considerable strength in the 6th and 9th wards, where most of its members resided. Hermann Pfäfflin, the German historian who came to Rochester 30 years later, tells of the arrival in 1835 of an agent of the New York Staatszeitung, editor's note which Marx had written for, who collected 100 subscriptions to that Democratic weekly, which continued to find a ready market in the city for many years. As the number of German readers increased, the desire for a local journal mounted, and Dr. Lewis G. Miller established the short-lived Rochester Germania early in 1849. Although that weekly soon expired, G.H. Haas and H.A. Blau founded the daily Beobacher in 1851 and the weekly Beobacher am Genesee a year later. Their democratic sentiments helped to support the efforts of the German Democratic Association, which successfully engineered the election of 4 of its members to the Common Council, all from the 9th Ward during the 50s. The German influence faltered only in 1854 when one faction of the old Whigs organized the Know Nothing, or American Party, and captured control of the city that fall. However, the rise of the Republican Party the next year, with its less exclusive, more idealistic stand, welcomed German support. Adolf Nolt bought control of the daily and weekly Beobacher and gave them a Republican slant. A new paper, Der Anzeiger des Nordens, which had made its modest bow as a weekly 2 years before, now undertook to rally Democratic support. The contending parties, both eager to attract voters, each nominated and elected German aldermen, the Republicans in the 8th Ward and the Democrats in the 11th in 1858. Thus, the brief flurry of nativism had an opposite effect and spurred Germans as well as the Irish and others to secure and assert their privileges as naturalized voters. Indeed, Bernard Schoeffel, first captain of the Grenadiers and elected to the Common Council in 1852, served as a special naturalization agent for the Germans during the mid-50s. The outbreak of the Civil War checked the influx of immigrants, but kindled new loyalties among the earlier arrivals. Several of the officers and many of the young men in the German militia units hastened to enlist in response to Lincoln's call for troops. Thus, Rochester's first local unit, the 13th New York State Regiment, had one German-speaking company under the command of Captain Adolf Nolt, the editor of the Beobacher, who had received his training in the French army of the Algiers. When Nolt resigned following a severe wound, Captain Henry Getch and then Captain Henry Lahm succeeded to command. More than a tenth of the 200 volunteers in this unit lost their lives during its bloody engagements, and the proportion was still higher among their 350 fellow countrymen who joined in the 108th and 140th New York State Regiments within the next year. Numerous other Germans from Rochester also served individually or in small groups in various units. Louis Ernst, former commander of the Union Guards, rose in successive posts to the rank of colonel in the 140th Regiment, succeeding Patrick O'Rourke, Rochester's Irish hero at the Battle of Gettysburg. wrap this up with one last word, because I think it's important to talk about the elections of 1872 and then the election of 1876 to wrap up this chapter. In 1872, the Democratic Party basically realized that they were not going to be able to win, but a new party had been founded, the Liberal Republican Party. The Liberal Republican Party opposed the Radical Republican program of Reconstruction. Radical Republicans in Congress had tried to impeach Democratic President Robert Johnson, who took power after Lincoln's assassination, and failed. Civil War General Ulysses S. Grant was the Republican Party's candidate in the 1872 election, and Grant was seen as an ally of the Radical Republicans who wanted to really have Reconstruction. His opponent on the Liberal Republican ticket was Horace Greeley, actually. So we could say that he was maybe the first socialist candidate in a major presidential election. However, Greeley by this time, like I said, was the less progressive candidate than Grant in here. Now, there was actually a socialist candidate that ran also, and that was Victoria Woodhull. Victoria Woodhull had actually made a lot of money as a Wall Street investor, and she was a feminist, suffragist, free love advocate. She was also a spiritualist. Maybe we'll talk about her in the future, but in the 1870s, she decided she wanted to run for president. She was going to be the first woman to run for president in the United States on the Equal Rights Party. And she chose as her running mate, although he never was consulted about it, but she chose Frederick Douglass as her vice presidential nominee. Now, Victoria Woodhull is important because she was a member of the International Working Men's Association, or First International, even though she was sort of a capitalist, which is kind of interesting. But she was an advocate for workers' rights and definitely, obviously, an abolitionist. Actually, the First International had a lot of German and Irish immigrants in it as well. Actually, in 1871, the Germans expelled most of the English-speaking members of the First International's U.S. sections, and so that's kind of when it went into decline. Karl Marx did not like Woodhull. He expressed disapproval of her and approved of her expulsion from the New York section of the First International. Woodhull thought of herself as a revolutionary, and she believed in a materialist economic approach to the problems of the day. In an article titled Women's Suffrage in the United States in 1896, she said that suffrage is only one phase of the larger question of women's emancipation. More important is the question of her social and economic position. Her independence underlies all the rest. So she's considered a socialist feminist. So there you go. So that was the first woman to run for president. And then also running in that race was Horace Greeley, who ended up being endorsed by the Democrats on the Liberal Republican ticket. And then Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant ended up winning. Also that year in that election was when Susan B. Anthony was famously arrested in Rochester, New York for illegally voting in that election. Now, Ulysses Grant, like I said, he won the election of 1872, and for a while, the so-called radical Republicans in Congress, the biracial coalition of Republicans that had been elected from the South, went to work on the Reconstruction plan. However, then in 1876, the election of 1876 had dire consequences for the radical Republican program. So the Compromise of 1877 was an informal, unwritten deal that settled the dispute between Republican Rutherford B. Hayes, who ended up getting the White House on the understanding that he would remove the federal troops, thus ending Reconstruction. It was a bargain for the presidency because it was contested, although W.B. Du Bois points out there was tons of fraud in the South, and even though blacks were supposedly enfranchised, they were effectively prevented from voting. Hayes had received 185 electoral votes, while the Democrat Samuel J. Tilden had received 184 electoral votes. But Tilden won the popular vote by around 300,000 more votes than Hayes. So we'll give W.E. Burghardt Du Bois the last word on this. So this is from Black Reconstruction by W.E.B. Du Bois. The bargain of 1876 was essentially an understanding by which the federal government ceased to sustain the right to vote of half of the laboring population of the South and left capital, as represented by the old planter class, the new northern capitalist, and the capitalists that began to rise out of the poor whites, with a control of labor greater than in any modern industrial state in civilized lands. Out of that, there has arisen in the South an exploitation of labor unparalleled in modern times, with a government in which all pretense at party alignment or regard for universal suffrage is given up. The methods of government have gone uncriticized, and elections are by secret understanding and manipulation. The dictatorship of capital in the South is complete. The military dictatorship was withdrawn, and the representatives of northern capital gave up all efforts to lead the Negro vote. The new dictatorship became a manipulation of the white labor vote, which followed the lines of similar control in the North, while it proceeded to deprive the black voters by violence and force of any vote at all. The rivalry of these two classes of labor and their competition neutralized the labor vote in the South. The black voter struggled and appealed, but it was in vain. And the United States, reinforced by the increased political power of the South based on disenfranchisement of black voters, took its place to reinforce the capitalistic dictatorship of the United States, which became the most powerful in the world and which backed the new industrial imperialism and degraded colored labor the world over. Moreover, Americans saw throughout the world the shadow of the coming change of the philanthropic attitude which had dominated the early 19th century with regard to the backward races. International and commercial imperialism began to get a vision. Within the very echo of that philanthropy which had abolished the slave trade was beginning a new industrial slavery of black and brown and yellow workers in African Asia. Arising from this, as a result of the economic foundation, came the change in attitude towards these darker people. They were no longer brothers in black, they were inferiors. These inferiors were to be governed for their own good. They were to be raised out of sloth and laziness by being compelled to work. The whole attitude of Europe was reflected in America, and it found in America support for its own attitude. The great Republic of the West was trying an impossible experiment. They were trying to make white men out of black men. It could not be done. It was a mistake to conceive it. The North and Europe were still under the sway of an individual laissez-faire in industry and hands-off government. It was easy, therefore, for the Negro to persuade itself whatever happened politically in the South was right. If the majority did not want Negro rule or Negro participation in government, the majority was right, and they would not allow themselves to stop and ask how the majority was made. They knew that an organized intergroup was compelling the mass of white people to act as a unit, was pounding them by false social sanctions into a false uniformity. If that part of the white South which had a vision of democracy and was willing to grant equality to Negroes of equal standing had been sustained long enough by the standing federal police, democracy would have been established in the South. But brute force was allowed to use its unchecked power in the actions of whites to destroy the possibility of democracy in the South, and thereby make the transition from democracy to plutocracy all the easier and more inevitable. Through the rift of opposition between votes for and against the Negro, between high and low tariff, between free land and monopoly, plutocracy drove a silent coach and four. What the South did in 1876 was to make good its refusal earlier to give up slavery or to yield the political power based on the counting of slaves. And so the South rode the wind into the whirlwind and accomplished what it sought. Did it pay? Did it settle either the Negro's problem or any problem of wealth, labor, or human uplift? On the contrary, it made the government of the South a system of secret manipulations with lying and cheating. It made its religion fundamental hypocrisy. And the South knows today that the essential Negro problem is just as it was: how far it dare let the Negro be a modern man. God wept, but that mattered little to an unbelieving age. What mattered most was that the world wept and is still weeping, and blind with tears and blood. For there began to rise in America in 1876 a new capitalism and new enslavement of labor. Home labor and cultured lands, appeased and misled by a ballot whose power the dictatorship of vast capital strictly curtailed, was bribed by high wage and political office to unite in an exploitation of white, yellow, brown, and black labor in lesser lands and breeds without the law. Especially workers in the New World, folks who were American and for whom America was, became ashamed of their destiny. Sons of ditch diggers aspired to be spawn of bastard kings and thieving aristocrats, rather than of rough-handed children of dirt and toil. The immense profit from this new exploitation of worldwide commerce enabled a guild of millionaires to engage the greatest engineers, the wisest men of science, as well as pay high wage to the more intelligent labor, and at the same time to have left enough surplus to make more thorough the dictatorship of capital over the state and over the popular vote, not only in Europe and America, but in Asia and Africa. The world wept because within the exploiting group of New World masters, greed and jealousy became so fierce that they fought for trade and markets and materials and slaves all over the world until at last in 1914 the world flamed in war. The fantastic structure fell, leaving grotesque profits and poverty, plenty and starvation, empire and democracy staring at each other across world depression. And the rebuilding, whether it comes now or a century later, will and must go back to the basic principles of Reconstruction in the United States during 1867 to 1876. Land, light, and leading for slaves, black, brown, yellow, and white, under a dictatorship of the proletariat.
Arise, you princes of salvation, arise, you wretched of the earth, for justice under contemplation, for better world's in birth. No more traditions change your mind, arise, you slave, no more enthrall. The earth shall rise on new foundation, we have been lost, we shall be all. 'Tis the final conflict, ready stand in its place. The international Soviet shall be the human race. 'Tis the final conflict, ready stand in its place. The international Soviet shall be the human race. We want through condescending saviors to rule us from a judgment hall. We work as astronauts for their flavor, let us consult for all. To make the thief disgorge his booty, to free the spirit from your cell. We must ourselves decide our duty, we must decide and do it well. In the final conflict, may we stand in its place. The international Soviet shall be the human race. In the final conflict, may we stand in its place.
You know what I'd rather do? If I thought, every now and then, that I'd ever be a slave again, I'd take a room and just end it all right away. Because you're nothing but a dog.